coming. This is our last department colloquium talk of the semester, but we have a number planned for the spring. This is Dr. Paul Haught, who joined UD last year. He is the Associate Provost for Graduate and Professional Education. Big shot. Prior to turning to the dark side, as we say, he was definitely a philosophy professor at Christian Brothers University in Memphis, where he taught primarily business ethics, bioethics, environmental ethics, but a whole range of other classes too, everything from logic to social and political philosophy, aesthetics, 20th century continental philosophy, philosophy of the South.
Yep.
His research is focused primarily on environmental ethics. He describes it as exploring the relationships of place and character to the world's contemporary ecological challenges. And so today he will be speaking to us about the environmental ethics of Pope Francis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Haught.
Well, thank you, Tripp, so much for this, and thank you all for the time today. This is a real treat for me. As Tripp mentioned, I'm in higher ed administration, so I've been at UD since January, so not even a year yet. And really my job here is to really kind of curate and cultivate the graduate portfolio and do a lot of other things to really kind of help the institution sustain itself for the next 150 years. So that's really the work I'm in. And it's a very different role than being a philosophy professor in a lot of ways. But I will say, and I hope it comes across today, that this work in philosophy is very, very intrinsic to how I do my work today. And it's formed me in all kinds of ways, teaching at a Catholic institution, as I did for the last 17 years, and now here, being part of another Catholic community, also very important. These institutions have charisms, and so that's in part how I ended up doing this paper, or presentation. So Tripp asked me to do this, and I said I can't do anything new because doing a new project involves a lot of reading and intensive research and the pain and suffering of writing, as you all know. And so I had to dig into the well, and then I gave him an option. I could do something kind of one of my more recent rigorous works or something that was more public. And I got asked to do this presentation right after the encyclical came out in 2015. And I was asked originally by a group of kind of progressive Catholics in Memphis. That's where I was, called Pax Christi, and I did this little talk with a Friends community, a Quaker community there. And then I got asked over and over again to do this talk. And so it's interesting to do this again. Most recently, Pope Francis added a kind of postscript to Laudato Si.
Very sorry.
Pardon me.
I'm just going to steal these chairs and get them over to you. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that's good. And please, this is, I'm used to the flow in and out. So he offered this postscript a year ago, updating his, not really, I think we'll talk about it in a little bit, but really kind of looking at the impact of this encyclical when it came out, and kind of making some reflections on what that impact was and what still needs to occur. So I hadn't done that part yet. So what's new today is really reflecting on what that is adding to this overall document and what impact that has for us as people on earth, because Francis wrote the encyclical not just for Catholics, but for all living humans. And so in that regard, I think this is an opportunity to look at this as a kind of public investigation of what this document means to philosophy. So my approach is this. So I'm looking at this as a kind of introduction to this document, but also to environmental philosophy. When this came out, I think I recently taught a class in environmental ethics, one of my main courses that I've taught over my career. And it just struck me, not so much that this was a kind of, systematic argument for a certain position in environmental philosophy. It has elements of that, but really that it's a document that I think is most easily read, or maybe most beneficial to read, as a kind of invitation to the hard thinking that needs to take place to really understand our situatedness in the world today. And so when you read it, You'll be, if you haven't read it, it's impressive for his dabbling in the kind of science of ecology, his willingness to really try to engage that, not in a kind of thorough and deep way, but I really read it as a kind of invitation for all of us to think better and think harder. And so that's the real takeaway I have on this. And so it made it my approach to this is really to kind of pull out some themes that I noticed in reading it from a career in environmental philosophy, and thinking about also how I've taught environmental philosophy for years to students. So it's a different take than you might expect if you were coming at this text from a kind of perspective on church history or in the sequence of encyclicals that popes have issued over the years. It's really more of a kind of, if you read it kind of from the secular, philosophical, environmental, ethical tradition that I came out of, even though working and learning in Catholic environments, what does stand out? And so I do encourage you, as I say here, please read this if you do from a number of vantage points. Also, one other caveat, this was designed really for people who hadn't read the document. So I have years of experience teaching Plato and Aristotle to students who didn't read the assignment. So that's also coming across here, I hope. And an apology. This is a little bit of death by PowerPoint, so that's something you should never do. But this is an attempt to really kind of engage key passages of the text to really kind of see how these themes play out. So a little bit of historical context. So when this came out in 2015, it was right before the big UN conference that led to the Paris agreements that we've exited from, entered back into as a country, and are likely to exit from again. I should say, when I was asked to do this, I knew the election was coming, and now I have to deal with my own feelings about what has happened relative to kind of thinking about this work, and we'll see if that comes out. I'm sure it will in one form or another. But a couple things to just highlight here. This was there was a big kind of media hype around this document. People knew it was coming out. There was a lot of excitement, and there was a lot of speculation about what the Pope would say. And you'll see that some of the things he does pretty quickly, and these were actually dropped before the full encyclical came out, on his sort of stance on science and his stance on climate change. So kind of affirming that the science is something we should pay attention to, and that climate change was real. Those were the kind of the things that people were looking for. Those got teased out and dropped early on before it came out, and then you'll see how that comes. I'll show you how that gets expressed in the encyclical. So that's the kind of public context in which this was taking place. And then, there is the Pope that was chose his namesake in part because of his affection for the model of St. Francis of Assisi. And so when you read the encyclical, you see that the beginning of it is this real kind of praise and engagement and centering of the whole document in terms of kind of Francis's expression of the relationship of humanity to creation. So a couple other things to note here. I put a bullet point in just about the size of it. What's interesting about this encyclical, it has a lot of footnotes, so it reads somewhat scholarly. Most of those or a good portion of those are to prior encyclicals or to statements of bishop conferences around the world. But there's also recognition of academic philosophers, so Paul Ricoeur gets cited, and others. So you have this kind of recognition that this is somebody, this feels like somebody who really understands the literature. And when you read it, it's definitely a very nice introduction to kind of how environmental thinking has been evolving since the 60s and 70s of the 20th century. So that's a bit of context here, and then some notes here about what's going on globally in terms of temperatures. Because today we actually have another COP meeting. This is right now in Azerbaijan. COP 29 is taking place. So Azerbaijan is a country that is very oil dependent, production of oil dependent, and there's not a lot of optimism that something huge is going to come out of that. We'll see, especially with the global political environment today. So just a quick note really about the context of environmental ethics. So environmental ethics, as I like to introduce it, takes seriously this notion of whether nature can be harmed. And so ethics is, in my way of framing it as easily as I can understand it, is about anything that really pertains to the possibilities of help or harm. And so when we're dealing with moves and actions relative to environmental ethics, environmental philosophy, we're asking a question about how and what, nature, or features of nature, can they be meaningfully harmed? And that's not obvious. It might seem that way. We've grown up in a culture where environmentalism has been part of our discourse, but it hasn't always been that way. And it's still today a substance of critique. And if you get into philosophy deeply, you realize even more sharply that these are meaningful questions about what is it that we're talking about. And I even noticed in this, Francis refers to the moral value of species. And that's a contestable term. So what is a species such that it could have value that you could respect? And so, as opposed to an individual organism. So those are things that stand out here. But that's the philosophical domain in which I'm coming from in this. Then there's something else that stands out very early in the framing of the document. If you look at environmental, philosophical, and related literature coming out of the 70s and 80s, there's a need that you find often in these texts from that period to craft a narrative about this new field or new way of thinking. And it's often juxtaposed against the Enlightenment. And so there's definitely a situatedness of Laudato Si relative to that history, and you can kind of see it here. So I pulled the famous kind of villainous quotes from René Descartes and Francis Bacon about these are often used as ways to kind of articulate how these Enlightenment philosophers created the path for modern science to emerge. But they're also often used in that early environmental ethical literature to see these are the statements that also have embedded in them the attitudes that cause harm to nature. And so you see right here, this is what I do here is I pull a lot of quotes from the document, and here Francis is saying we've come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, and there's no doubt in my mind that in the background of this are these types of phrases from the philosophers who were very, very important for the rise of modern science and are often now implicated in environmental crisis. So I've identified 8 themes that I think are worth just thinking about and recognizing as moves and important steps toward a kind of argument that Laudato Si is making. And the first is just to recognize that the document as a whole is a kind of extensionist argument. And so in this regard, the document, the encyclical, is making a stand that we're expanding moral standing or moral consideration to something other than human beings, right? Or something other than bald white men, right? And so something else is happening there. And so extensionism is just it's a way of describing a form of moral progress. And so here we're talking about actions or moves to enlarge the moral sphere, or another way is thinking about expanding the moral community. And so here's some ways in which that gets expressed. And so here Francis clearly takes the step to indicate that nature, and here that species statement, that species can be harmed. Right? So this is uttered in a kind of unargued way, but it's clearly illustrating a position that we would want to investigate philosophically or understand. This is where he's coming from. So he's clearly now taking that step toward a kind of extensionist move in ethics and saying that species can be harmed. And then another note here, and just that, acknowledging that other forms of life have value. And in that regard, we can see the evolution of the document. Another theme is environmental crisis. And this is more a kind of political statement in as much as it's or less than a philosophical one. Because here, Francis is saying that we're in an environmental crisis. And maybe you've grown up in a world in which this seems obvious. This is the given situation we're in. But yet we also know that this also bothers people. It's a statement that has that sentiments are aroused around. And as a result, his decision to focus on this is a powerful kind of political move, a rhetorical move for centering the document as a whole. And so in this regard, he's saying this is why action is needed. We are in this emergency, and as a result, we have actions that we need to take. And so I won't dwell on these quotes, and I told Tripp I'll share this with you. But you can kind of see here that in the context, this is something real. But there's a couple things to note about this. Again, these are of political salience in addition to kind of philosophical interest. So you can disentangle two kind of important claims about the way Francis engages this notion of environmental crisis. One is to say that the kinds of damages that we're seeing to the world are measurable. And for maybe a certain kind of religious worldview or other kinds of worldviews, this is a threatening move in some ways, that this is a decision, a choice to embrace the techniques and methods of science to understand the situation that we're in. The second claim, and this one is really probably the one that causes the most angst for people who are politically, is that we're the cause of this. So you've probably grown up in a world in which, well, it's the change of the solar, radiation. That's really a kind of natural thing, so it's really not our fault, and so forth and so on. I won't get into that here. Francis's argument or statement is that this is our fault, and I'll show you where he says this. So, relative to environmental crisis, he immediately kind of goes into there's a scientific consensus. So we're depending on the experts to really help us understand what is possible in terms of our actions, or what might not be possible anymore. What kind of hope might we have to address this crisis? And then also a statement here where he's affirming that climate change is indeed real, and what it's likely, and here is a forecast of its longevity. And then, as human beings as a cause of this, and so the term we would use is anthropogenic. And so here you can see that here it's a little bit more hesitant, released mainly as a result, greenhouse gases released mainly as a result of human activity. But then I love this, because of us. You kind of can't get more direct than that. And so again, these were, in 2015, important rhetorical moves to set the scene for where the Pope was coming from on this issue of environmental crisis. So leaving no ambiguity around it. So in some respects, less philosophically interesting, but when you think about the document as having, one, I mean, where was this going to be read? A lot of the Catholics in the world are in the global South. This was going to be taken up and taught by priests and deacons and other kinds of groups, giving this kind of note that we have a lot of complex thinking to do in order to understand how to respond to an eco-crisis. The next theme that I want to pull out, and this is throughout the whole document, is that there are this interplay, or this recognition that environmental crisis is wrapped up in attitudes of dominance, about how human beings dominate each other, dominate the world, are dominated by our own artifacts, as well as a kind of sense of indifference that we don't give a about the world. And so in this regard, I think this is in some respects, I think, a very critically important move. It has certainly its roots in Catholic social teaching, and so it's not a surprise to see this in that respect. In environmental philosophy, you see several different kind of starting points for rhetoric around and discussion around dominance, and so there's this notion from biblical literature of human beings given dominion over the earth, and whether that should be really more construed as not domination but stewardship. And so there's that dialogue that's clearly being implicated here. There's also another piece that's arguably missing from Laudato Si that you would see in the history of environmental philosophy, and that's really kind of specific notions of domination and indifference around the treatment of women, of racial harm, and that this is not, these aren't really distilled in any very specific way, if at all, in the encyclical. And so taking a kind of critical look at it, you might think these are kinds of maybe intentional absences or just blind spots on the part of the Pope relative to this. But nonetheless, there's a consistency that you could draw and say, well, that's certainly a next step. That there are other vulnerable populations, or there are other kinds of circumstances where these patterns of dominance and indifference really need to be understood. And so there's an abundance of feminist and ecofeminist literature that I would refer you to really kind of get a full sense of how deeply this can be explored. You'll see language coming up that kind of suggests that, well, remember, this is the Catholic Pope, and we have a patriarchal tradition here that is being advanced and articulated at the same time that this argument is going to be made. But some examples from the text of where these attitudes are expressed. And so here, this might be the most poorly chosen quote I have, but it's I can't let go of it. And so here he's arguing that a kind of modernist view of individualism is something that's preventing us from really kind of getting out of ourselves to appreciate the other. And in this regard, it could be implicated as a cause of our indifference. This will be familiar to anyone familiar with Catholic social teachings, preferential treatment for the poor, preferential option for the poor. But you can see a lot of this throughout the document. And I would venture the claim that one way to kind of easily consolidate what this whole document is encouraging us to do is you will find environmental crisis where you find poverty. If you want to generate the moral attitudes you need to really get out of environmental crisis, you need to connect this to the circumstances of the poorest among us. Likewise, there's a sense of those who are marginalized, and that this is also recognized here. In one sense, you have this notion of the need to acknowledge, to remember, to get out of ourselves, to see that there is suffering, there's something to be compassionate about beyond our own circumstances. And that includes familiar Catholic values around the unborn, but also those who are marginalized in certain ways. This gets an extensive treatment throughout the document, and this is how the human relation to technology. It's pretty pessimistic, all things considered. So essentially, we're in a tough place. Technology has outpaced our evolution to really kind of control us, and so. But I do think it's important that there's this acceptance of this dominance that Francis is also trying to make us aware of. But technology is something that is, by and large, implicated in environmental crisis. It's not our friend. But he's not a total pessimist, and so there are some statements that you find in the encyclical where he is saying, well, we still need this, and so there are green technologies, there are, we can appreciate the artistry of human beings and the built environment. And so these also come out as expressions, and so there's a tension there. But I think it's definitely weighted toward pessimism and not as much on the techno-optimist side. Then, of little surprise, but also very important to note, is this notion that we're also dominated by our utter commitment, capture by market forces, market mentality, consumerism, and so forth. And so this is really kind of the biggest challenge. This is the biggest kind of comparative worldview to the one Francis is encouraging us toward, which I'll get to in a moment, around integral ecology. But it's this notion that we're really kind of captured by the market, dominated by the market. We use it to dominate each other. We praise each other for our ability to navigate our lives and our actions and our businesses within the market. And so this is certainly the area for greatest action. So again, that's the theme of dominance and indifference. Another theme that comes out is, and this would be important to investigate in any kind of deeper discussion of environmental philosophy, is human-centered thinking, because obviously this is also implicated in environmental crisis. And so is Francis a non-anthropocentrist or an anthropocentrist with regard to value? And so there are some moves that he makes, and I'll show you some quotes here that indicate that this is not your kind of standard, human chauvinism or hubris about humanity. There is a tempered anthropocentrism that he's going to embrace. At the same time, you'll also see that Francis is very much committed to a view in which human beings are special, and that specialness is a source of, one, our responsibility, but also something that we have to manage and mitigate against environmental crisis. And so here you have some notions that stand out. You would spend, if you took a class in environmental ethics, there'd be certainly a few weeks where you're talking about intrinsic values of nature, and you see that here. That here's this notion that that species have intrinsic value in themselves. I think it's note there's obviously, I'm not spending a lot of time in this discussion on the biblical and sacramental works of components of the document, but you do have this notion of anchoring the whole argument or whole discussion in a biblical and Christian framing, and so pushing against this notion of a kind of that hubristic, that human chauvinistic anthropocentrism. Here he calls it tyrannical. So anyway, you can see what the directions in which he's going. At the same time, it's also this notion, as I mentioned a moment ago, that human beings are indeed special and deserving of maybe a higher level of respect. Our dignity is elevated relative to the rest of creation, and this comes out pretty consistently as well throughout the encyclical. But it's a familiar ethical position within Christian ethics, focusing on our inherent human dignity as human beings, but wanting to also position that relative to the rest of creation. The fifth theme, and this is, can you think about the notion of being dominated by the market and being captured by market forces, this is where there's an effort to really engage the document in global affairs, helping us decide choose the best kind of political design in order to achieve ecological balance in response to environmental crisis. This is maybe one of the more controversial statements coming out of the encyclical. Certainly bothers some folks that this is that the crisis is a call for us to move forward in a bold cultural revolution. So he's anticipating or calling for a massive change. And if you think about the power of those forces that have captured our attitudes, it makes sense that this is the injunction. But you can see this in certain kinds of political, philosophical concepts. So he talks about the common good and our common home. He talks about planetary ethics and planetary planning. And then we also have these notions of rights that are properties of nature. And so here, access to safe and drinkable water is a basic and universal human right. So we can start to see a formation of Francis's perspective on what he expects our political institutions to achieve. And so here, just some other statements here. You can see a call for justice around equitable distribution of goods, and environmental goods in particular. I think this is a nice statement here. The Christian tradition has never recognized the right to private property as absolute or inviolable. So these are contestable places for us, but you can think also to what degree these have become dogma for our worldview. And so he's pushed, the hope here is that Laudato Si is going to give us more reason to kind of think more critically, more carefully, more broadly about the world that we're in and what kinds of political institutions we need. Other controversial statements within global affairs, so that this isn't unfamiliar, but his call here that the wealthier nations pay for the environmental damages and challenges for lesser developed countries. You can see again this notion of our capture by technology. We've got to change our perspective and anchor them more on human freedom and justice, more escaping from the technocratic paradigm. This is an important statement that our interdependence obliges us to think of one world with a common plan. Again, thinking of this document as for the people of the planet prior to a major meeting, a very hopeful meeting that was coming forward in Paris on what to do about climate change. And then another trope in environmental philosophy is that the local and actions at the local level are it's a kind of in Christian ethics principle of subsidiarity, but that the local takes precedent. And so we want to make sure that all individuals have power and freedom over their own movement and action, and environmentalism begins at the local. And then as we're going through it, another theme that emerges, and this is more as a kind of ethical theoretical move on his part, but this is where Francis is encouraging us to think about our moral development and our moral thinking from the standpoint of the cultivation of virtues. And so in this regard, virtues are character traits that are excellences, right? That if we possess them, we're in a position to do good in the world or see the world in a different way than we would if we don't possess them. And so here, some of these clearly have a Christian flavor, but there's also a strong literature in environmental philosophy around environmental virtues and how these are should be part of our planning around moral education and our just kind of overall approach to ourselves and self-development. And so we can talk about this maybe more when we get into the discussion, but it's another noteworthy move of the document that when you're thinking about using this, and I think about those church communities that would have been talking about this and are still talking about it today, that part of what's being sought here is the development and the cultivation of the right character to respond adequately to environmental crisis. The seventh theme, and this gets probably the most play today as a kind of legacy of this document, and it's probably the most philosophically interesting component of Laudato Si, and it's this idea of a worldview of integral ecology. In the 70s and 80s, as environmental philosophy was coming into the fore, you might have called this deep ecology. Right? It's this notion that we're all interconnected. But what does that mean? And what does that essentially bring into the fore in terms of values and scopes of action for what a human being can achieve in the world? And so it's really kind of no mistake here. He's a very deep thinker on this, that his philosophy here really requires a rethinking of what it means, or a special kind of thinking about what it means to be a human. When I get to Laudato Deum, or Laudate Deum, and I won't spend a lot of time on that, but you can maybe compare this to his concerns about AI, right? And how technology is continuing to challenge a certain notion of what it means to be human, or maybe invite its development in other kinds of ways. But I won't spend a lot of time on it. It's complicated, but I think it's you can see here, and you can see in other of the statements that I've shared, this idea that we really can't think in silos about, one, our political choices, our individual moral choices, about our attitudes toward the more than human world, that these are all integrated and need to be in some kind of coherent way. From a Christian, Catholic, theological perspective, that's going to be delivered in terms of transcendence. And so you're going to look to a relationship with the divine and the history, the Judeo-Christian history, the body and figure of Christ, to really articulate the kind of anchor point for this notion of integral ecology. In my own research, and I grew up in the household of a theologian, I would kind of stop at intellectual flatland, he called it, and kind of work within this kind of secular dimension. But the argument here gets its vitality, its richness, and some of its texture from this notion that this is also something, this integral ecology, this design of the human person that's being encouraged, is in very central ways connected to a relationship with God. And so we can't really do that anthropology in Francis's worldview without also very much linking it to the Catholic and Christian theological worldview. But keeping in mind, he wrote this for all humans, and so it was ecumenical in some of its outreach as well. pausing here, I mentioned a little moment ago the issue of maybe there's a kind of failure to think about the role of, of the feminine, of women in this work. You can see right here a statement that would probably jars me in certain kinds of ways. So the best way to put men and women in their place, putting an end to the claim of absolute dominion over the earth, is once again to put forward the figure of a father. Again, this is not controversial in some respects, but when you've read and taught as much feminist philosophy as I have, that certainly stands out as about as patriarchal as you get as an expression. But there is a purpose for that, and you can think about, well, what might that mean to put us in our place? We'll come back to that momentarily. So again, there's a kind of tying this all together that's achieved through the document. So as you think about what's being delivered here, it is this injunction, this argument to think deeper about what it means to be a human being in response to environmental crisis. And I think you have a very important and practical opportunity for all of us. And so that if this is going to be a meaningful and impactful document, the next step is to use it to encourage growth in environmental education. And that, again, this one statement, I think, kind of stitches almost all of it together, that environmental education should facilitate making that leap towards the transcendent, which gives ecological ethics its deepest meaning. So here, this is, again, a quick approach to discerning what are some of the themes that have come out of Laudato Si. So this is what I've talked about so far. So looking at this, the encyclical can be read as an injunction to extend moral standing, moral considerability to the non-human world. So it's an extensionist perspective in that regard. We are in an environmental crisis. It's really important to frame our thinking in response to environmental crisis in ways in which there are forces and structures and institutions that we use to dominate each other, we use to dominate nature, and that we are dominated by, and that we should not be indifferent about those structures of domination. And then, but it's not, full-blown kind of non-anthropocentrism where we're dealing with tensions between the values of non-human things and human beings. It's resolved in the sense that human beings do indeed hold greater value, so there's a kind of human-centeredness here that's being embraced. And then, continuing on the summary here, that the way to really get to that worldview is to begin to think and link damages to humans, the poorest of us, to their ecological origins. As we shift to the worldview of integral ecology, that will take the acquisition, the cultivation of virtues, of habits of character that allow us to discern environmental value in the world. That worldview is called integral ecology, and that ultimately it's grounded in a theological framework that calls us to care for creation. So it would ordinarily stop there, but he went on. And so last year, another important text came out called Laudate Deum. And in this document, which is much shorter, and if you read it, there's a tone to it. It feels very sad. So it's 8 years past the first, the original encyclical, and you can tell he's frustrated. He's upset. This document, this encyclical didn't do the work, or we haven't listened yet. We haven't woken up. Things are getting worse. And as I showed in the first slide, you can see that the temperatures have changed already since 2015, and this will likely be the warmest year on record again. This one came out before another UN conference on environmental action in Dubai. And there were some challenges with that. This wasn't occurring in the same spirit of hope and optimism. We have a challenged world. The war on Ukraine is raging. This is days. The conference happened in December, so the Gaza and Israeli conflict started right after this came out. And so you have Biden not attending, in part because of that conflict. Pope Francis was ill, and didn't attend himself. So there was this intention to kind of get there and say, hey, I'm still here. This is an important moment for us. But that didn't all go as planned. And then some of the major, Russia's not even involved, but other players here are not all in agreement about what their role should be after as part of a UN agreement. But there's still the document. So some themes do carry over. So he's in this adjunct to the encyclical. Environmental crisis is still real. We still haven't quite gotten our heads around that. It begins with concern for the poor. We're still dominated by our technology, but you can see that 8 years, this is the rise of artificial intelligence, and he's worried about what that means for our humanity. And then there's this again, reinforcement of this notion of human-centeredness, but he starts to temper it a little bit. This is situated, and so we have to recognize that human life is incomprehensible and unsustainable without other creatures. So again, part of the main message of integral ecology is just coming back to, if there's a better way, a tighter way I can package that, here's how I'm going to say it. There are some new themes that I think start to emerge as well. One is, and I didn't have a good term for this, but I want to call it a kind of informational justice or epistemic justice that he's noting here. And it could be more forceful. This is in some sense the problem of fake news that is being activated in some respects in the way that this new way of thinking about the legacy of Laudato Si is being reflected upon. And so you can see here's some just ways in which this is being expressed, that we just have active forces in our kind of loud social media world that are trying to simplify things and then blame others for our crisis that have nothing to do with the challenge. Blame it on the poor. Blame it on the poorest countries. Blame it on the whoever. And so he's frustrated about this. And so there's a need for a call, it seems, for a response to these media forces as well. And then there's, to me, what really stands out is a kind of, this is the way this postscript concludes, with a kind of, well, we're trying to act like God, and you know what happens then. And there's a history of this in environmental philosophy as well. It made me think of Bernard Williams, describing that back in '95, that the proper attitude to deal with environmental crisis is Promethean fear. So we need the fear of what we might do to upset the gods, to really rein our actions in. Another expression was another article, David Wiggins, referring to, we need holy dread to really kind of anchor our sentiments and attitudes here. We need this fear of God. Not as poetic, but Francis says, praise God is the title of this letter, for when human beings claim to take God's place, they become their own worst enemies. And then it ends. And so it's an interesting, thinking about this in terms of our own appreciation for these. These aren't philosophical arguments. These are kind of moral, theological essays to motivate change and motivate us. And they end there. I was going to stop on this slide, but I have one more. And the original Laudato Si was followed by an embracing of various action plans. In fact, there's a formal action platform that the Vatican has put out to organize churches, schools, countries to take efforts to really carry forth and implement the messaging of Laudato Si. And our community, and so I'm new here, so I haven't had a chance to really engage around this, and I don't quite have a feel for how still alive this is. But when you read through this, so feel free to click on the link here, this is what UD has embraced relative to this as well. And it's really rich. This is really well done. So kudos to everyone who worked on this, where you have this recognition of programs that we have and centers that we have and classes that we have that really speak to these calls, these goals of Laudato Si. So rather than ending with Promethean fear and fear of God and all of that, we do have a little bit of tradition here where we're trying to create some good in response to this document. So let me stop there. Thank you for kind of letting me walk through that with you. I know it's a lot. Like I said, death by PowerPoint, whatever you want to call it. And so if we have time for conversation, looking forward to that. So thank you.
So the kind of science and religion tension there. So at times it seems like the moral obligations come out of the kind of interconnectedness, the kind of integral ecology, whereas at other times it seems to come out of that whatever it is that makes humans special that can't be accounted for in scientific ecological terms. How can you kind of help us resolve that tension?
Well, so there's a very explicit statement in Laudato Si where he's saying these shouldn't be in tension, right? That the science and religion are different modes of explaining the human experience in the world. So he's at least optimistic that they're not in tension there. What I would say isn't as apparent in this document, but might be worth kind of pulling on is human, the evolution of life and evolution of humanity. And so there's not a kind of sense of this as evolutionary science that's also in play with regard to a kind of fuller environmental ethic. That creates its own challenges. It also creates its challenges on that anthropology that was referenced before, but it is part of the scientific worldview. And so there are other ways to approach environmental philosophy and theology that do take evolution more seriously. So in one sense, he's like, look, we've got to trust the climate scientists. We have to trust our best economists. We have to trust the social theorists who are understanding what's going on in the world. And even like our own behavioral science, there's an embracing of it. But I would say kind of more from what are the kind of more almost metaphysical implications of a worldview that also takes evolution seriously. That seems to be more absent from this. And it's been one of the harder elements of modern science to really gain fuller traction, from my perspective, within Christian theology overall. Yes?
Kind of building on that question, so I was really happy to hear this because I actually taught portions of this for the first time in Intro to Philosophy this semester. So seeing how sort of some of your ideas mapped onto mine, that was very interesting, so I appreciate it. But building off of what Tripp was saying, one of the things that sort of stands out to me, and perhaps this is sort of a connection, but I wonder what you think, is that to me it seems like Pope Francis is calling for a sort of paradigm shift in terms of how we actually think about ourselves and our relationship to the world, which in some ways even standard sort of environmental ethics doesn't always actually sort of do, right? And so the sort of science thing, and I don't know if some of this could be also tied to his Argentinian roots, but the integral portion seems to, there's an emphasis on sort of holistic thinking, right? That modern science sometimes doesn't actually do a good job of because it becomes sort of reductivist, right? It's trying to sort of boil it down to the smallest parts, but doesn't see how the parts actually sort of relate to the whole. And that sort of perhaps creates a sense of self that's disembedded, right? And so I'm wondering if you're seeing that too. So in a way, like maybe he's actually trying to think of how scientific thinking can be improved if it was sort of more integral or holistic. And I think that that's something, the reason I said Argentinian roots is because, you know, in certain traditional indigenous thinking in Latin America, for example, that sort of holistic way of thought is much more baked into it.
Yeah, excellent. So I wanted to, I kind of cheated a little bit here in that this is, as I when I was talking about it, is really the richest piece of this, at least from a philosophical standpoint. It's the hardest to articulate. It's probably the hardest to really kind of stand out there and defend. But at the same time, it's where kind of some of the action is that we're kind of excited about. This holistic kind of, whether it's explanatory pluralism, but again, it's looking at the fullness of the human being. So when I first read this, this is a little bit of external context. I had just read a book by my dissertation director called Integral Ecology that had nothing about this in it. And it came from his own kind of interest by a guy named Ken Wilber. And Wilbur there's a kind of whole kind of enterprise around this type of thinking around what it takes to really think the world in the right way. And really to kind of build those kind of holistic thinking activities into some kind of system. So I kind of expected to see that. And so when I read it, I thought, well, this was more kind of gestural toward what I saw in the early American and European philosophy around environmental issues, and that's that deep ecology. So still trying to kind of work its way toward a kind of statement. But you do see this there. Now, as far as, I think you're making a really good point, because we can't separate this ultimately from where we all originate our thinking. So his Argentinian roots is also the Jesuit education. You can see strong elements there throughout the encyclical as well. So there's some familiar kinds of moves that deserve more commentary, but are also certainly embedded there. So I definitely see what you're referring to. I read it again over the weekend since this was coming up, and wanted to see how I think about it today. And I was looking a little bit for some of those moves. So in what way do kind of those marginalized groups or other kinds of ways of thinking? This reads very Western, ultimately, as a document. Even that kind of original statement here about let's position this relative to the European Enlightenment. That's the story. So other modes of being, other ways of thinking the human experience in the world aren't as developed. He does say in various places that we need to listen, we need to hear, we need to be in dialogue at very local levels with other people, other communities. So in that respect, I do think that there's certainly opportunity to that. I had, about 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to be part of the formation of a statement by all of the Christian Brothers schools. So these are, that was the charism, the order that sponsored my last institution, and we were meeting in Spain and in France. It was really incredible. But most of the participants in those meetings are from South America, and so you definitely, just the excitement, the feeling, the way that the way this document was alive for members of that community as opposed to, say, the American constituency that was there was very interesting. I didn't know quite what to make of it, other than that this is definitely talked about a lot more. There's a much more excitement about what can be achieved in partnerships, especially they embrace technology of online collaboration between institutions globally. And this was all, again, those schools coming together to show how they're contributing to this Laudato Si action platform. And I don't know, again, I don't have a feel yet for how UD, and maybe some of you have been part of that, how that, is that excitement still there? But it definitely felt we didn't come to this in the same level of preparation and disposition as our colleagues from South America and Asia did at that meeting. Yes?
Yeah, I think, let me comment something a little. I'd like to hear you say a little bit more on the integral, holistic thinking. I wonder if there's this kind of paradigm shift, sort of fundamentally different way of thinking that's there, because when you have these elements of, attending to the poor, seeing the interconnectedness of life, and all of the other themes that are in there. But sort of towards the end, it's sort of, there's this compartmentalization going on. Economic, ecological, it's on the last slide, ecological education and so on. So there seems to be this kind of compartmentalization of things. And it seems that, I raise this because sometimes we classify problems in a compartmentalized way, like the environmental problem is over here, police violence is over here, health is over here. So take, for example, something like Stop Cop City in Atlanta. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but for anyone who's not, it's where they're building, there's talk, and I think it's perhaps unfolding, but the building of a particular space that's in the Atlanta forest. And they're building a structure to house and train police officers and give them a space to kind of live in this little kind of city. And it costs a lot of money and so on. It's going to have films and all these things. But what's interesting about it, the reason why I'm bringing it up is because it's not clear to me that people see that as an environmental issue. Because the Atlanta forest dwellers were saying they're defending this land, but it gets filtered as a police violence issue. So I'm wondering, with integral, maybe we need to think about, issues in this connected way, and it seems like that could be there. But at the end, it doesn't seem like there's falling. It's thinking about it in a compartmentalized way, if that makes any sense.
It makes a lot of sense, and thank you for that. I'm not familiar with that example, but I know I want to learn more. It's not terribly apparent to me. So some things I think are missing from here. There's this recognition of what can you achieve in one 150-page document that does so much, and a good portion of it is just on the sacramentalism of this thinking and this paradigm shift. So you don't see, for example, very kind of clearly explicated approaches to place, for example. That's when I think about the example that you just gave. It's about this other impact. So something about being in place, being trained to be a police officer in a space that is also green and has these other elements, is changing us and speaking to us in certain kinds of ways, and maybe would contribute, I would argue it would, to that ecological virtue cultivation. But we might not be explicit about it in various contexts. So I don't see this being fully developed here. And I remember looking for, what were my colleagues in environmental philosophy saying about this, and I remember somebody said, "Oh, y'all should read this. It's kind of interesting." And then it was like, it's not really there. And in our, there's definitely more on the kind of theological side and religious thinkers, but less so in kind of environmental philosophy. So I think that's where this develops. But I would say there's still interest, very much so, in how, and this was where my own research was going a number of years ago, around kind of thinking about how the world educates us that we're in, how the built environment teaches us certain kinds of values. And so we could be very intentional about that. And you could certainly make the case that fits into a kind of integrated holism around what it means to be human and what it means to think about, the environment and so forth. But if it's not intentional, that also in that space there's this, we'll think about, what season we're in if these crops are going, and what's growing or what isn't. How's this related to food or food insecurity? And it's all those types of things also, I think, are part of the broader context. But if I more affirming of Francis, he's going to keep coming back to go to poverty, and you're going to and be attentive to that. Be as compassionate as you can about the circumstances of your human brother or sister, and then you'll also start to see why and to think about why they're in this circumstance, and to what degree is that also illustrative of the environmental challenges that they're facing, and that we're all implicated in creating and sustaining.
Any other questions or?
Yeah.
With the frustration expressed in Deum and the Baku tone, really falling back 20 years it seems, what do you think is Pope Francis's steps forward? Is he keeping a local lens?
Yeah, so, the last I really heard of him was the kind of both sidesism of the U.S. election. They're both evil. And so I don't know. I don't know where he is, right? And what's his legacy going to be to whoever succeeds him in that place? So that's probably a cynical take on it. But I don't see this you can just see. Well, I tried. Right, here's this effort that had so much excitement, and things are even worse. And no doubt, the Ukraine war is on his mind in writing that letter and issuing it. So the prospects of it, I think, would be more what are we going to do with it, right? This is a political manifesto as much as anything, and so how can this enrich and enliven and inform those who are inclined to listen to that voice, to see it as authoritative within the Catholic milieu. The power of it was that it did seem for a moment to stretch beyond the church, right? And that was the original intent of it. This was for all living human beings. And you can see this kind of, we still need to wake up as maybe the message of Laudato Deum. And it's going to take God to save us, in a sense, from to do that. It's dark. I read it as very dark. Not looking. Yeah, you look. I think it's probably surprised a lot of people the way it. I don't know. Have you read it? Have you?
No.
Yeah.
I've not read through those. Looks interesting.
Read it. I mean, read both. These are incredible pieces. I mean, if you think about it, and just Laudato Si, if you haven't read it, it is what I said before, an invitation to recognize just how much we need to know. To understand environmental crisis, and then you put that against how much we're being discouraged from knowing anything today, right? There are forces to really undermine education. I feel this very viscerally as somebody who's trying to sustain an institution when these forces are out there, and what are we delivering? So
So it's not hopeful. I mean, you'd think that hope would play an important role, that there'd be a virtue of hopefulness or radical hope or something. Is there a theme there?
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I mean, that is very also explicitly written. Mm-hmm. But I'm juxtaposing it against that thing. So there, I don't want to give the impression that injunction to hope, that call, the reliance on faith, and that God will take care of us isn't part of the narrative as well.
Okay.
Yeah. But that is interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because the transcendence point, it could be like, God help us and wait. But it'd be interesting to put that in conversation with Latin American liberation theologians like Gustavo Gutierrez or Leonardo Bach, who emphasize seeking liberation in the immanent and taking responsibility with it. And then that you get a different vision. It's not, the hope that we want, but it is somehow, you're not going to wait for God to.
And that's an interesting point. With the I don't see that as overt in this in this document, and yet that is a whole other orientation toward the role of God in our lives and human lives, and specifically relative to overcoming incredible environmental challenges in a sense. Thank you.
Well, let's thank Paul for speaking to us today. Thank you all for coming out.